You know that moment when you realise the months quietly slipped away and you're already looking back thinking, hang on, a lot of really good records came out this month. January tends to do that. It arrives with all the expectations of new starts and clean slates. And then before you've even had time to process it, you've got half a dozen albums that are already competing for space in your head. What really struck me about January 2026 though wasn't just the quality of the releases. It was how varied they were. Guitar-led records that almost feel cinematic, straight-ahead albums that still manage to sound deeply personal, projects that sit right in that sweet spot between tradition and something quietly modern. None of these records feel like they're trying to prove anything. They just sound like musicians saying, this is where I'm at right now. So I want to talk through 5 albums from January that I keep coming back to. These are records that reward repeat listening. Records where small details start to reveal themselves the more time you spend with them. Let's start with one that for me immediately set the tone for the month. Julian Lage, Scenes from Above, which was released on the 23rd of January 2026. Julian Lage is one of those musicians where it almost feels unnecessary to talk about technique. We all know that side of things is covered. What's interesting about Scenes from Above is how little it's actually about virtuosity, despite the fact that the guitar playing is predictably extraordinary. This album feels open and spacious. There's a real sense of perspective to it, not in a dramatic, sweeping way, but more like looking down at familiar landscapes from a distance. You recognize the shapes, but the emotional weight has shifted. Harmonically, it's very much Julian being Julian. But there's a patience here that really stood out to me. The track Red Elm is a perfect example of that approach. The melody doesn't arrive with a big statement. It sort of drifts in and settles. What I love most is how comfortable the music is with silence. Notes are allowed to decay naturally. Phrases aren't rushed, and the band sounds completely at ease with just letting the music breathe. In terms of significance, this album feels like another step in Julian Lage's move away from being purely known as a phenomenal guitarist, and more as a composer with a very clear inner voice. There's a maturity here that isn't about restraint for its own sake, but about clarity. Every note feels intentional, not because it's clever, but because it belongs. This is a record that really shines late at night or on headphones. The kind of album that doesn't demand attention, but rewards it when you give it. Next up is Vance Thompson's album named Lost and Found, which was released on the 16th of January 2026. This is one of those albums where the title tells you a lot, and it does so honestly. Lost and Found genuinely feels like a collection of emotional states, rather than a tightly wrapped narrative. And that's very much part of its appeal. Vance Thompson isn't trying to tidy anything up here. There's a rawness to this record that feels deliberate. The compositions are melodic, but they're also willing to sit with uncertainty. Harmonically, there's enough tension to keep things interesting, without ever feeling forced or overly complex. My favourite track, Mixed Feelings, captures that balance perfectly. There's warmth in the tune, but that's offset by moments that feel slightly unsettled. Rhythmically, it sits in a relaxed pocket, but there's always something gently pulling against the groove. It's one of those tracks that seems to reflect your own mood back at you, depending on when you hear it. What makes this album significant for me is its emotional honesty. It doesn't chase trends, and it doesn't lean heavily on nostalgia either. It simply sounds like a musician being very clear about what they want to say, even when what they're saying isn't neat or resolved. This is a record that grows with you. The first listen draws you in, the later listens are where things really start to unfold. Next, we have an album by Martin Wind named Stars, and this one was released on the 30th of January 2026. One of the things that really elevates Stars is the personnel, and especially the presence of Kenny Barron on piano. There's a calm authority that Kenny brings to any session, and you can feel it throughout this album. Nothing feels rushed, nothing feels ornamental. Every piano line feels considered, supportive, and deeply musical. Martin Wind has always had this remarkable ability to balance lyricism with structure, and Stars might be one of the clearest expressions of that I've heard from him. The bass is central to everything, but it never demands attention in a self-conscious way. Instead, it acts as a guide, quietly steering the music while allowing space for everyone else. The track Staring at the Window Waving Goodbye is a standout, not only because of the title, which already paints a picture, but because of how vividly that image is translated into sound. Kenny Barron's touch on this track is beautiful, understated, warm, and incredibly patient. There's a reflective quality here that feels almost conversational, like a thought being formed in real time rather than something pre-planned. In terms of significance, Stars feels like a meeting of musicians who don't need to prove anything. When you've got players of this caliber, the music doesn't need to be busy. It just needs to be honest. And this album absolutely is. Now we have an album by Paul Ricci named The Path, and this one was released on the 16th of January 2026. There's something very grounded about The Path. From the opening moments, it feels like an album made by someone who knows exactly who they are musically and is completely comfortable with that. Paul Ricci's playing here is confident without being flashy. The focus is firmly on feel, groove, and forward motion. The tunes have momentum, but there's always space for interaction within the band. Nothing feels rushed and nothing feels overthought. My favourite track, Around the Block, is a great example of that balance. It's got a familiarity to it, almost like a tune you've known for years, but there's enough detail in the arrangement and improvisation to keep it feeling fresh. The groove locks in quickly and there's a sense of enjoyment in how the musicians respond to one another. What makes The Path significant is its clarity of intent. This isn't a record that's trying to reinvent jazz, and it doesn't need to. Instead, it reminds you of how powerful it can be when musicians focus on doing one thing really well. It's an album that feels very human, very playable, and very real. Next, we have an album from Bangs and Talbot named Smokin Aces, and this one was released on the 23rd of January 2026. Stylistically, this is the album that sits most clearly in the acid jazz realm. You can hear it in the grooves, the rhythmic confidence, and that sense of forward momentum rooted in jazz, but clearly informed by funk, soul, and club culture. This album has energy, not frantic energy, but that steady, infectious pulse that has you nodding your head without even realizing it. Bangs and Talbot clearly thrive on interaction, and there's a looseness here that very much feels in the spirit of classic acid jazz records. Tight enough to groove, loose enough to breathe. For me, the track Subway Strut is an absolute highlight. It's got that street level feel that acid jazz does so well. A tune that feels just as at home on a late night playlist as it does in a live setting. The groove never lets up, but there are plenty of harmonic and rhythmic details that reward closer listening. What makes Smokin Aces significant is how naturally it occupies that space. It doesn't feel like a throwback, and it doesn't feel overly polished. It sounds like musicians who understand the lineage of acid jazz and are comfortable with letting that influence come through without overplaying it. When I look back at these 5 albums together, what I love is how clearly they reflect where jazz is at right now. Not as a single sound, but as a broad, living ecosystem. You've got introspective guitar records, emotionally open compositions, subtle ensemble playing, groove-driven projects, and stylistic crossovers all existing side by side. January 2026 didn't arrive quietly, it came in with confidence, nuance, and the reminder that jazz doesn't need to announce its relevance. It just needs musicians who are willing to be honest in their playing. If you want to continue hanging out with me here on the channel, I'll pop a video in the corner for you to click on now. Other than that, I'd like to say thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.